Friend of a Slime is a survivor-like that releases today, July 4th, for the price of $4.99. It's available on the PC, specifically Steam and itch.io, and will work on both Windows and Linux, and has you fighting waves of enemies in 10-minute matches to kill a boss at the end and move on to the next level. But before I begin this review, this key was obtained from the developer for review purposes. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? So let's not beat around the bush. You're here for the gameplay, so let's start there. This game follows the popular format of Vampire Survivors, hence the survivors-like genre term. The basic formula is that you don't have an attack button. The attacks come automatically from your character, and you control their movement. Coming into contact with enemies will reduce your health, of course, you take damage, and once you go down to 0, the match is over. Simple enough. And of course, this comes with weapons and upgrades that are gotten by defeating enemies and picking up their experience to level up. So, not that much different on the surface than other survivor-likes. Now, there's many factors to how this plays out, of course, but let's start with the basic one. The weaponry and buffs that you can equip on level up. You get a weapon and an equipment for your character to begin with, as well as one for your slime, which I'll get to in a little bit. This is chosen before the level, of course, and you can unlock new starting weapons with money you earn through levels as well as different equipment. The style of weapons, of course, is probably what you're the most interested in, and I will admit there's a good combination of familiar, interesting, and, well, normal weapons here. You get what you would expect at first. The melee weapon, the sword, that circles around you over and over again. A bow that will shoot randomly at the closest enemy. A shield that somehow pulses and pushes enemies back. I mean, that makes sense with a shield push, but the way that it comes out, it's a little bit AoE. But we've seen all that before, and these all have unique upgrades that power them up. The sword upgrades will give it more damage and circle around faster. The bow will shoot more arrows and more damage. Okay, what you would expect. Where things get more interesting to me is some of the more out there weapons. The tornado, for example, which basically hits along a horizontal line on the screen, sort of. It's a little bit off, it's a little bit above or below you, there's a variance in it. And it does make it a little bit interesting in terms of your movement because it may open up a path that you weren't expecting. Or the axe. Yes, the axe. You'd think this would be something like Castlevania's axe, but this axe more like a boomerang. But this one in particular is my favorite weapon because you do better when you catch it on its way back. It allows you to rethrow it and you start getting multiple out. There's some variance in this, so you do have to react quickly to how the axe actually paths. And of course, grabbing it while avoiding damage is a key part of that exercise. The equipment upgrades are along the same lines. You've got your basic damage upgrades, being able to attack faster, take less damage, and the like. But then you have things like an execute chance, which basically one-shots enemies based on a low percentage. Then there's the best ones, in my opinion, with things like the size of projectiles, which actually can get pretty big and can be ridiculous in the best of ways. They're fun to use. Now, what ends up being the most unique aspect of this particular game is the fact that you have your slime friend with you, which holds one weapon by himself. He only gets one during a run, but he does get one. Now, you'd think that wouldn't really be that different from any other Survivors game, because most Survivor games allow you to use multiple weapons at a time. So it's just like that, you just start with 2, right? Well, not so fast. The thing is, the slime is a companion who doesn't take damage and does follow you, but with somewhat of a lag with him. So, meaning that based on your movement, you can move the slime to attack enemies without necessarily putting yourself in danger in the best scenarios. And that can be fascinating to experiment with, especially in the early goings of levels. As for the challenge that develops in the gameplay, this is all about responsiveness and your movement patterns, and that can be a mixed bag at points. On one hand, I do appreciate that the different combinations of weapons do provide different holes in enemy lines that you can run through depending on your combination. Because as the level goes on and the enemies start coming a little bit stronger and more numerous, the number of holes and areas that you can run to decrease. You need to find those holes until maybe you can get some of the more taking damage perks if you go that route. There's a lot of different combinations that will make you move differently, which I will say, it felt actually more important in this game than in a game like Vampire Survivors, which is saying something. That's at the core of the design here. With that said, there's also some familiar elements here that still rear their head for slime. That being actually picking up the experience you earned and the sort of complications for that. See, you kill an enemy, they drop experience that you can level to upgrade, like I said. The problem being that most of the time, the circular nature of enemies walking at you probably means that when you kill something, something will be right on top of it, especially as the crowds grow, around the 2 to 3 minute mark, especially in this game. So you have to play this game of, okay, let me move in such a way to get enemies off the experience or get the experience right away so that I can, level up. And it can get actually annoying to play that game at times, especially with larger enemies. These enemies could take you down rather quickly. You could get overwhelmed in merely a second. And it's especially noticeable here because the enemy types, despite having different looks and HP and knockback resistance, or at least I think there's knockback resistance, they all are of an iteration that just walk at you. No range, no alternate pathways, no weird movement patterns. So they're just walking at you. And you could play to that, but a lot of the times that means you have a lot of experience that you need to gather, and you have to do this weird movement to get to it. It can get annoying at times. In addition, I will say that luck is something that definitely plays a part in the difficulty and enjoyment. Don't get me wrong, it can in other Survivor games like this too, but in particular here, upgrades to existing weapons are usually a lot more important, especially those first, second, and third upgrades, than getting a new weapon, for example. They're that much more powerful. And there's a limit to the number of weapons you can carry at one time, but weapon upgrades provide a reasonable boost, especially the right one early on. So, for example, when I did have the sword as my starting weapon, I immediately upgraded it as soon as I could, because the amount of damage the first upgrade did compared to others and the movement speed on it, it was a lot more damage, almost like 3 times it felt. And so, yeah, I was getting that upgrade. And if the game kept on not giving it to me and giving me other things, it started to be like, okay, you don't want me to win this round, did you? But in that same breath, dealing with that randomization is a strategic choice that I will admit did provide some reasonable variance in the gameplay. So other than leveling up, you could also grab upgrades that are randomized on the ground in these chests. The thing is, the playing field you are working with, and not having any sort of minimap, you don't necessarily know where these chests are. So you're taking a gamble if you just wildly go looking for them. But at times, that could be exactly what you need. The weakest part of that gameplay, and the thing that I would suggest to the developer take a look at, is the environment. Yes, you have different biomes and everything that are themed, and as you unlock new levels, the initial creatures and the creatures that come get a little bit tougher and tougher. And while you could add different enemy types, some things that you see in Vampire Survivors or some other games like it, I think the environment itself could be an easier way of creating some difficulty and interesting differences in gameplay, like forcing shorter areas that you have to navigate or deal with, or even hazards to deal with. Like, I was surprised in the swamp area that going into the swamp didn't slow me down. That seemed natural, and yet didn't really happen. This could have added a lot to the experience in the end, because right now, it really comes down to a straight numbers game in terms of output. And even though the movement and all the upgrades obviously make a difference, it feels like that could have been easy to add and really play with. Granted, there are some complications with that, collision detection with the enemies and such, but compared to other things you could have done, yeah. Now, with all the complaints that I've had, I want to make something clear. I do think that the base experience is good. It's probably in the top third of the Survivor likes that I've played in terms of simplicity yet good strategy. There is something to the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. And it's present here. It is simple yet has complex mechanics under the surface. It's just that for that next step, I do want to see maybe a couple more weapons that are a little bit more unique. The environments, the elements that could take this game to the next level, like how Vampire Survivors did. And I know I've been mentioning Vampire Survivors a lot. It's the main experience that I've had that I can really compare this to, but it should be measured on that and that alone. The game is great. It's just, it could be awesome. With me talking a little bit about the gameplay, a bit about the gameplay, let's transition over to the presentation for a bit. The game's presentation is somewhere between cartoonish, Dragon Quest monsters, and the Super NES. Okay, that may sound like a weird-ass combo, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the game's designs and artwork are amazing. But I also don't necessarily think they need to be for the gameplay in question, and they do the job. I do like some of the designs here, like the alligators and some of the enemy slimes. They have enough character to them to make them appealing, but aren't necessarily over the top in a bad way. Now, some of the designs I'm not a fan of, like the zombies, they just feel a little bit off to me, but again, it's to enhance the gameplay, and I do think they do the job in that way. Animation-wise, when it comes to the movement of enemies, it's an interesting range. There are ones that I do really appreciate the work on. The mushrooms and Anamane, yes, I'm doing this for the bit with the whole Nemo thing, but it captures a sort of movement that is bouncy and gives them a personality to that movement. They're not fast, but they're giving their all, and it's just sort of like hopping along, like they're just there and they're gonna get you. It's just gonna take a little bit. Then there's things like the scorpions that, no, it's simple, but it just doesn't really fit. I don't know how to explain it. It just doesn't feel right. And I know that's a subjective thing, but it's the thing about this game. 90% of the movement animation is good or great, and I think it makes sense for the type of enemies that you have. But there's always an outlier that sort of just sticks out like a sore thumb, and not in a good way. Where I think that Friend of a Slime may turn people off or onto it has to do with the attacks and flare of the damage that is happening on screen. The enemies dying, the effects of the weapons, that whole thing. There's a reason why slot machines and gacha boxes have the animations and colors to them, and why people are attracted to them. We like shiny and bright things telling us that good things are happening. And the same goes with Survivor games. It's very apparent in a game like Vampire Survivors, for example. You like seeing the color and the numbers go up and the enemies dying and the way they die. There's a satisfaction to that that's sometimes hard to put a finger on. Something about Slime's effects just doesn't reach that top level that makes me go, yes, this is it. I look at the individual animations and the effects coming off things, and I think, yeah, they're good, but they need something more. The tornadoes that fly by are well animated, and they're probably the best example of a little bit of pizzazz to them, at least in my opinion. And shurikens have an elegance to their flight pattern, even though the art behind them is simple. And yet, it doesn't punch me in the nose with it, which I do think is necessary for a game like this at times. On the other hand, there are times where there's a little bit too much noise when it comes to the effect of the weapon. The sword is the prime example. It makes this cloud of dust around it, which I understand makes sense if you're hitting the enemy. You're getting into a little scuffle, it shows you the impact of it, and even though it may not necessarily make logical sense, it gives the player information about what's happening and the range that it's hitting at. But when it's doing it, when it's not hitting things, it just sort of doesn't make sense to me and sort of makes me look at it like, oh, it's just there. Not that it's doing damage, it's just there. Which sometimes with some of these Survivor games, those pixels can make a difference of whether or not you're hitting an enemy or not and how you're moving. So it being there when I'm not, that's some information you are losing. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that despite having moments where there's a lot of effects and enemies on screen, I was surprised that I saw no slowdown at any point during my time with the game. Even some of the bigger titles in this genre do have that problem at certain points, but here it was zero. And it's great to see, even though it's not the most complex of characters and environments, it is still processes and background handling that has to be done. Memory allocation, removal, and it can start to have choke points with resources. So, well done, dev. I know the engine can handle that, but still, well done. As for the sound design, I admit I'm torn on this one because I don't think I have a good enough basis to really understand what the best sound design for a game of a Survivor type would be. But I will say that I think that this one is a bit weaker than others in the genre. Look, this is the type of game that I see a lot of people say that you can play it on mute or even play it in the background of watching a YouTube video and it'll be just fine. And the thing is that you want to give the player the most important information with louder sounds so that they pay attention to the most important elements so that they bring their attention back to it. But what's the important elements here? Well, it's not the sword swinging around constantly. Like, the sound itself isn't a low quality, but it started to grind on my mind over time. Just that zzz, zzz, zzz. It didn't feel useful in that way. Okay, but then there's things like the axe, which with its throwing mechanic that I mentioned and catching making a sound, getting that information is more important. You know you're doing well if you keep on hearing it. And the sound playing for it, or what I think it is, the catch and the re-release, doesn't make sense to me from a logical standpoint. It just doesn't sound right. That's the weird thing about the sound design. It felt very much like an alternative design. And maybe it's just me not jiving with it. Or maybe I'm expecting something completely different based on other experiences. Just take a listen and hear what I'm talking about. Because I'm going to be honest, it's the second weakest element of this game. As for music, it's fine. It's nothing special. You'll put a YouTube video on over it or put on your own music and you'll get more out of it. I will say that the main music lacks some energy compared to others in the genre. It does seem like this should be an epic battle most of the time with taking out numbers of enemies, and it feels more like a little saunter in the park. Granted, locations usually have themed music, and it's alright for that element, but it's nothing that I would also listen to outside the game. Again, this music is not as important as other mechanics that I've discussed, but take a listen and hear what I'm talking about. finally, let's finish off the story. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that I was expecting that much story in an obviously gameplay-focused Survivor game. It would be silly to expect otherwise, right? Despite the fact that friend of a slime implies, well, they became friends. There's a relationship. How do they become a friend? What troubles do they have as a pair? Maybe I'm being naive, but I was expecting something here? Like anything? That's part of the point that drew me to this game. Granted, I don't know how many people know this, because you're probably a lot younger than I am, but there was an old game on the NES called A Boy and His Blob, and that sort of gave a connection to me. A boy and his blob, a friend of a slime. Yeah, I guess maybe I was expecting a little bit more. It's not like that game had a lot of story in it, but, you know, it did seem to imply it. I'm doing this for a little bit too long, aren't I? Look, this is not the game for story. Leave it at that. In the end, I did enjoy my time with Friend of a Slime, and I do appreciate what little elements that it brought to the table that made it stand out from other experiences. I liked the slime element, having a buddy there that you had to move a little bit differently, and I felt that some of the weapons and combination of weapons worked rather well. The difficulty curve worked nicely despite having variance from match to match, and while it never blew me away in any one category, I did have fun throughout it. Granted, if you're expecting from the get-go to have an experience that rivals Vampire Survivors in presentation and spectacle, you're not going to get it here. But the strategy and rewards for choosing the right combos and moving in conjunction with them was what made me want to play more of the game. Honestly, for $5, you could do a hell of a lot worse, and especially in the genre. And it's solid. Solid enough to be an 83 out of 100. In my scoring system, that makes it a solid buy. Unless you're hurting for cash. But that doesn't take into account my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective element of games and tries to match a game to you. If you strongly fall into one of the following categories on screen, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if the game lies in the buyability rating for you. Now, I will admit that when it comes to Survivor likes, I don't necessarily have as much experience as other reviewers. I mean, yes, Dynasty Warriors is probably the one I have the most experience with, even though I wouldn't even classify that as a Survivor's like. It's a Musai. But the thing is, it sorta is. But I do understand the gameplay and the actual design around it. It's just that I haven't played as many because, well, I play a lot of games and a lot of different genres. And these take a little bit more to understand the little details that tell them apart. So, go watch another review. If you want to know what's coming up next on the channel, you can join the Discord below. And I'll give you an incentive, because Friend of a Slime developer gave me 2 extra keys that I could give away to people. Didn't want to make that at the start of the video, sort of a reward for people who actually made it this far. And I'll give it randomly away to whoever's in the Discord and actually wants it. I mean, it's a free game. Why wouldn't you? As to what's coming up next, yeah, I don't know. I'm going to look to see what games are coming out in July. I still am playing through 100 Line. There's a lot of frickin' endings. I haven't even gotten to the 3rd one yet because there's a lot of data and a lot of writing. Oh boy. As to what I'm streaming, 2 to 3 indies over on Twitch. Maybe I'll bring it over here. Anyway, that's it for now. And as always, keep on gaming.